this computer. Perfect. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session on prioritizing racial equity to address health outcomes at the local level. My name is Jessica Ehula In. I'm the Director of Programs at CityMatCH, and I am pleased to be joined here today by two lovely speakers, Katrice Cain, who's the Executive Director for First Year Cleveland, and Andy Wessel, who is the Community Health Planner for Douglas County Public Health Department. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. I also would like to shout out Zoe Mpofu of Buncombe County. She is unable to be with us as a speaker today, though she was planned to be due to some health issues. So please keep her in your thoughts, please. If you go to the platform, you will see an article attached that Zoe and a colleague authored recently. Feel free to look through that to learn more about the work that's happening in Buncombe County. That is Asheville, North Carolina. They were one of the first areas to really think about reparations and what that means in actuality for Black people. So feel free to check that out at any time. Keep admitting if you need to, Kiana. We will go ahead and get started. I want to touch very briefly on what this session is. When you saw this session and you saw prioritizing racial equity to address health outcomes at the local level, and you also saw the description, put in the chat what you were thinking or what you thought, your first thoughts when you came in to join the session. Please put that in the chat. And I see a note about audio issues. Can everyone hear us? Give us a thumbs up or a yes or any of those things. If you are having audio issues, I would recommend just logging out, restarting the platform and coming back in. That has seemed to help a few folks, just in case. All right, so I just want to touch really briefly. If you attended the CityMatCH conference last year, we had 4 wonderful plenary sessions. You probably remember the face of Katrice and Andy. We really talked about racism as a public health crisis and the declarations that are happening in cities across our nation and what that actually means. So now today, we're really going to move into, one, a look back at what's happened over this past year. But 2, we'll also be looking at the strides that specifically have been made in Cleveland and the city of Omaha, Nebraska, Douglas County. We also want to talk a little bit about the challenges that have been faced and the barriers. A little bit also about how are you as individuals, each person, each 118 of you on this call, how are you sustaining yourself through this type of work that is emotionally, physically, mentally taxing? What are we doing to really support one another and ourselves? We'll also be giving you all some time to work in breakout rooms. We really wanted to share an important skill with everyone. So we'll be talking about a persuasive method, messaging method that might be helpful as you're working locally, as you're trying to engage new partners. So we will also be talking about all of that today. I want to take a moment to say, in this space today, this is real talk conversation. This is not a light conversation at all. We want everyone to really come in, feel welcome, bring your concerns, know that you're around family, know that you're around folks who really care about this issue, and I really want to move towards transformative change. We are no longer in a place of incremental change, in a place of just kind of going slowly or going with the flow. We really want to challenge ourselves and our partners. So bring your full selves today. You may have heard and seen CityMatCH has been on this anti-racist journey for a little while. I will say for us as an organization, this work truly authentically began in 2018. And it began with very candid conversations about how we're doing this work internally. How are we even addressing racial equity? What are we doing to make sure that in our own house, we are practicing what we preach outside to everyone else? So end of 2017, honestly, we had very candid conversations. If you attended our conference in Rhode Island in 2019, we had a plenary session where we talked about the conversation we had. Chad Averish, our executive director, along with myself and a couple of my colleagues, we sat down and we looked at us. We looked at CityMatCH and we said, we have always been about equity. We have always been about serving communities and helping our members. How are we practicing equity ourselves? what does that then look like? And it took a real audit to look at, wow, why do we have policies like this in place, and asking those very hard questions. This past year, 2020, has been difficult, right? 2020 and 2021, we're in this ongoing pandemic. In 2020, I like to jokingly, but kind of facetiously say, people found out that racism still exists, right? And so in 2020, we actually did have the opportunity to go into some real joint commitment with a couple of other organizations, a few other organizations, as I should say. We actually have a public joint organizational commitment to anti-racism and racial equity with the Association of Maternal and Child Health Programs, or AMCHIP, the National Healthy Start Association, and the National Institutes for Children's Health Quality, or NICHQ. All four of us came together and joined in this statement to say we are committed to this work, and these are the steps we're willing to take. If you want to read more about this in detail, our joint statement is also attached to this session in the platform, but I'm just going to cover a few top level pillars that we said we would commit to over the course of all of our time and being in connection with each other. But firstly, we decided that this joint commitment was necessary because we know that health inequities that we see across this nation, the root cause of this, and our theme this year, as with last year, is examining the roots. The root cause of the inequities we're seeing is racism. And we wanted to state that plainly as a united front. And we know that's the reason why we're seeing inequities in birth outcomes, especially within Black and Native communities. We wanted to really use this joint statement to acknowledge the history that we lie on, and the history that puts us in a place of, puts Black and Native people in oppressive states due to that history. Also, we wanted to understand and address societal factors. Besides the clinical factors, we need to, in addition to having those clinical strategies, we need to think about what are the social strategies that can impact more of our population. And also, we've tried everything else. Quite plainly, we said we tried everything else, and it is time for us to intentionally be about this work. I just saw Zoe pop in. Zoe, just wave. I'll let everyone know that you couldn't speak today, but just thank you for being in the space with us. And I directed everyone to the article so that anyone can find that if you would like. All right. The three main commitments of the joint statement that I want to make sure you all know about. One, we have committed to doing our own internal work. And as I stated before, CityMatCH really dove into this work in 2018 with that internal look at ourselves. We look at our practices, our policies, our procedures, and how are we being equitable in the work that we do so that we can go out and teach equity-based work. What does that look like in actuality? We look at everything. We look at our employment and advancement opportunities. We look at financial decisions and how those are made. Who are our partners and how do we engage with folks? How are we intentionally engaging with new partners? Thinking about our personnel expectations and the expectations we place on everyone being equitable, also in our decision-making processes. How are we practicing health and racial equity in our decision-making? Additionally, the second pillar is to have a shared approach that acknowledges, really quickly, if anyone comes in, feel free to mute yourself upon entering, but we'll also try to do it on this end as well. But thank you all for being in. We also want to take a shared approach that acknowledges racism as a significant contributor to the racial disparities in birth outcomes. Thirdly, we want our commitment and our combined influence to educate our members and partners, jointly advocate for change, hold each other accountable, and expand the number of organizations willing to intentionally engage in this effort. So by putting our joint statement out to the public, by putting our joint statement out to you all, we want you to hold us accountable as well. We are here doing this work, and we want you all to make sure that you are holding us accountable and challenging us to change and transform the way in which we do work. All right. If you want more information on the joint statement, as I previously stated, please look at the attachment to this session and you will find it there. Feel free to share widely. Feel free to call us out and call us in when you feel like there's some place that we can be doing better. We are open to that. All right. Now, without further ado, I will bring in Andy and Katrice. And I will be bringing them in with the opening question. Andy and Katrice, if you could, please just answer this question as you come in and introduce yourself. Remind us of who you are. Feel free to open up with anything you'd like to open up with. Also, I was remiss and I didn't state this at the beginning of this conversation, though we stated it in the open. I am joining everyone from the Omaha land in Omaha, Nebraska, but Katrice and Andy will also introduce which lands they're on. But open with reminding us who you are, the lands that you're on, and also remind us where you were with your declaration last year and where you are today. What are some changes that have happened over the past year?
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Will do. So again, Andy Wessel from Omaha, Nebraska. Again, as Jessica said, she's also coming from Omaha, the Omaha people, as well as the Lakota people. This is their historic home. The thing to just know, just to provide some context, I'm not in a formal leadership position within the health department, which is one of the things that I sort of bring that's a little bit different. I am one of the co-facilitators from our health equity team with Miss Cheryl Bronson, so I want to name her and all the wonderful support that she gives to this work. But other than that, I'm staff. And so that's important because many people on this call are going to be at a staff level. And so just want to sort of own what you can get accomplished, still working at a staff level instead of a position of any sort of formal authority. As far as where we were, so we had done a lot of work. I'll talk a little bit and touch on the racial healing project that we were working on that was really a precursor to the declaration. But we did declare racism a public health crisis in the summer of 2020. We were excited that even here in Omaha, Nebraska, we beat out some of the liberal coastal bastions in terms of being able to do that. It doesn't happen very often. And one of the things that we were proud about was that we just didn't sort of state it. We had 22 action steps across 4 strategic directions that we had built out into that work. Because again, we had done a lot of precursor work to think about this beforehand. And so then the challenge was we were all still in the middle of COVID for trying to figure out how to follow up on all of those action steps. And specifically for me, I was the supervisor for our COVID-19 information line. We were, at this point, we've taken over 64,000 calls. And so that was a heavy sort of thing to be doing, both emotionally and just in terms of bandwidth, to then also still try to find ways to advance this equity work. Obviously, the equity work can be built into COVID, but so much of this was things like building up an office of health equity within the department, following up on oral history projects that were part of our racial healing project. And so we were basically in this place of okay, we said it, we even said we were going to do it to follow up, but we haven't gotten there yet. And I'm proud to say we actually really have gotten some traction over the last year. We do have an Office of Health Equity established that reports to the health director and works across the entire department. We've got the epidemiologist and community health educator in place for that. The health equity advisor who supervises that has been, haven't named who the person is yet, but they've offered the position. So they'll likely be in place on this. We've gotten our internal oral history work done. We're have meetings coming up with our external people to do this. And part of so those action steps are in motion now. On Thursday, we're having a community meeting that is giving the community a chance to weigh in and help us shape our action plan on how we follow up on that declaration so that we're doing it in partnership. And the last thing I'll just say is we have had staff turnover in terms of the people, our health director has moved on to a different position. My boss has moved on to a different position. They were critical in terms of the leadership level doing this work. But we had gotten to the point of had enough critical mass in the department that even with them leaving, we didn't hit a bump. We just kept right on going. And it feels like we're even snowballing more in terms of the number of people actively engaged in all this. So a good head of steam, doing well with where we're at. Tons of work still to do with it. Tons and tons of work still to do with it. But at least it feels like we've actually got some traction.
Good morning, everyone. I am Katrice Cain. I serve as the interim executive director of First Year Cleveland in Cleveland, Ohio, and I recognize and acknowledge the land that I'm on, which is the land of Erie. So our work began in November of 2019 as a call to action during our 400 Years of Inequity Summit. So this was a national conference that we convened right here in the city of Cleveland to really highlight inequities across health, education, criminal justice, and so forth. And we were really intentional to make sure that we weren't just bringing individuals together just to listen to national speakers and local speakers, but that we could really rally behind something that would move the needle, that would be a course of action that will galvanize our community to really put all of this information into action, into some form of strategy, into some form of focus. So with that, the decision to declare racism as a public health crisis was our call to action. It started with 6 organizations that came together, so public-private partnership, and having meetings and ultimately meeting with the Cleveland City Council to discuss how we can move this declaration forward. It took some months, but we were able to actually pass legislation in summer of 2020. I think it's important to note one thing that we do acknowledge is the fact that this work did start pre-George Floyd. These conversations were in our communities. These organizations came together in a time where we recognize this is an issue. And this is not to discredit or diminish any initiatives that took place after George Floyd, but we did see the difference. We started having these conversations at the top of 2020. Some people weren't as interested. They weren't as engaged. Some people just kind of shrugged us off. Some people were like, keep us informed on what you do moving forward, and we can discuss partnerships later. And then after George Floyd and the statements that came on regarding equity, the focus on addressing racism, those partners came back, those organizations came back, and they were really excited now. They're really interested. How can we help? What can we do? This is so important. And while we appreciate the fact that maybe it did take, unfortunately, the death of a Black man to spark an interest at the extent that they did, while we appreciate that there was some traction because of that. And unfortunately, it was at the result of the death of a Black man, but we do acknowledge that it did change the face of some conversations. We acknowledge that. But we knew that, this was something that we had to shed light on, that we need to talk about in our communities. Why did it take this incident? This hasn't been the first death by a police officer in our country or in Cleveland when we talk about Tamir Rice. Why did it take the specific death of George Floyd? So that led some conversations around our work as well, and how we should approach this work and engage organizations and stakeholders and community members around this issue, especially as we saw the statements coming out publicly and the commitments coming out. We wanted to make sure that we held our community accountable for moving forward and what they said they intended to do. So that was where we were about a year ago. We're still there, but we did realize that the declaration was just the first step. And there was a lot of work that needed to be done to even get the work moving forward. And I'll definitely share more insight into that in this conversation. So we've been working on an action plan. We've been engaging in multiple conversations internally and externally, and really trying to figure out, how do you move this work forward? How do you figure out the structures in place? How do you ensure that this is sustainable in our local communities and beyond, as we partner with the county as well, Cuyahoga County? Some changes that have occurred. We have a new health commissioner. Thankfully, this was one of our partners from the very beginning. She just got a promotion, so we're really excited about that. And we have a new mayor as of November. So Mayor-elect Justin Bibb, and we are excited to see how he will move his vision forward, and what his priority areas will be, and what his strategic action for the city of Cleveland will be moving forward, and how we can have alignment with the current work we're doing, and as we think in the next coming years. of what we want to do to really center equity in all facets of the city of Cleveland. So it's a pleasure to be here with everyone. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Andy and Katrice, for just those opening statements and grounding our conversation in where we were a year ago when we met in September 2020 and where you are today. And we're going to talk a little bit more fully about that. This next part is just a conversation. I've taken some of what you all put into the chat about why you're here, and we will discuss that as we go through this conversation. But as we're discussing, feel free to add any questions, any things that you're wondering about to the chat, and we will try to address them as we're going along as well. But it's great to hear about the changes that are happening in Douglas County with the establishment of the Office of Health Equity and the new politicians that are in office in the city of Cleveland, and how that will be helpful in shaping the work and moving it forward. I got this question from a wonder out of our chat, but something to think about. How are we even engaging local stakeholders in authentic and uncomfortable conversations such as these around racial equity specifically? How do you even begin to bridge that conversation and bring in folks? What has been you all's strategy in doing so? And what has been some successes in doing so and some challenges maybe in really just engaging in conversations with potential stakeholders?
I can start. Our approach was really looking at who's doing this work, who's already showed a commitment to it, who's leading initiatives within the city, who seems to be supportive of the work. So we started there. I think it's a good approach, a smart approach to start with partners that have a common agenda, that there's a level of similar focus and interest, and that way you can begin that conversation of what this work will entail, because they will have a good sense of the challenges and the barriers, and what will your community look like, or what are their interests or funding or any type of conversation around this work. I'm pretty sure if you find someone, a key stakeholder, they have similar knowledge or knowledge that you need to really engage in this work. So we started there. We work with our City of Cleveland Health and Human Services Committee from the Cleveland City Council and the chair of that council. And that's how we really introduced the idea of making this declaration. And with his guidance and his leadership and his wisdom, we were able to really brainstorm how we could do this. And he brought it to Cleveland City Council and the other committee members and said, hey, this is important work. We want to move this forward. We want your support. This is what we have a vision. So we started there identifying key people in the city that were committed to this work, that had interest, and that could help us on what is the path forward to move this within the city. So that was a great starting point. And from there, it just built. So who do they know? Who do we know? How can we build this and expand this partnership? Are there barriers and challenges? And if those are individuals that we need to speak to, then how do we engage in those conversations? Who do we need to have at the table to engage in those conversations? So I think it's about the approach and strategy and brainstorming with like-minded people to say, hey, okay, well, we're here, we understand, but we know not everyone's where we are. We have to acknowledge that and then figure out how do we have those different conversations, or how do we open this conversation in a meaningful way? And I think there's strength in numbers. And because of the work with the founding 6 organizations that started this work and then bringing that to the city council, we were able to, really move forward and begin just having conversations, thinking about the strategy, thinking about how do we present this to the community so we could have their support as well. What would that look like? What would that entail? And we're still in that process because that takes time. I don't think that's a one meeting or a 2 meeting or one conversation or a couple conversations. I think to authentically really do this work, you have to engage in ongoing conversations and slowly bring people into the conversation and really assess their level of readiness to do this work, because that is what it requires too. Are you ready? Are you committed? Do you have the capacity to do this work, especially for individuals who are leading this work. They're often represented from marginalized communities. You know, that's on our shoulders. So what's our capacity to do this work and to have to engage in conversations with others that may not be in support of what you're doing? You know, at what point do you engage in those conversations, or you say, okay, there's other work we need to do right now, and we have to protect this work as much as possible, and then we'll have those conversations with them, and then we'll figure out a strategy. Because I think sometimes it feels as though, what more do we have to convince you that this is needed and necessary? Do we need to have more blood being shed on the streets of our community for you to wake up and say this is of importance? So I think that it's important that you look at it from that perspective as well, and engaging in those conversations. What's the purpose of us coming to someone who may not be in support at this moment? Especially when we know there's so much work to be done. So where's the best fit to put our energy? And I think having people with similar interests and that commitment can help really think about the appropriate approach to doing this work.
I'll just ditto a lot of what Katrice said in terms of like finding the people who are already doing this work, who are already showing that they have that passion and commitment to making sure that equity is on the front burner, and specifically racial equity. A piece that I would add to this is like, what is the nature of the relationship? Like, are you building a relationship where people really feel like, okay, they're gonna hang in here, they're not going anywhere, which partly takes time and showing that you keep coming back and keep coming back and keep coming back. And there's also this piece of like, if this is truly a relationship of equals, which sometimes is hard when you're in government and you have a different level of power, but if this is truly a relationship between equals, then you can say what you need to say and we will hear it and take it and do what we can. We'll also be candid about the stuff that, you know, maybe we can't do this, or this is a struggle. Like, but just like with family, like, it's not always going to be pretty. It's not always going to be nice. Like, we got to have the real conversations with each other. And from that, getting past that sort of the nice stage or the place of distrust, like getting to the point where we're figuring out how we do this work together. And so I think that's the challenge, is like, there's times of tension and conflict and times where you don't want to hang in there in a relationship, and you still have to, you need to. Because that's just really what's required to remain in a true relationship.
Thank you both so much for that. We actually want to pull in some of our participants through a poll. We just want to get your opinion. One, to just pull out where we are with everyone who's in the audience. This quick poll will be coming up on your screen. In this poll, we're just asking 2 questions at the moment. Do you have a local declaration of racism as a public health crisis or something similar? So like, for example, Buncombe County has a declaration of racism as a public health crisis, public health and public safety crisis. So something similar, you have that in place in your local area, whether it be within your health department or not, is that in place? If so, is your area actively working on this declaration? Yes, no, or somewhat. Feel free to continue to just poll in. We're seeing them as they're coming in live. There's several areas. I believe on APHA's website, there are 180 plus local areas that have declared racism a public health crisis. But we know it's difficult to move this to action. So we really want to get real in this conversation about what does that mean and where are we today, if we're really honest with ourselves. Keep on polling in. We'll leave the poll up for another few seconds for you all. All right, I'll give you a little 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, we're going to end the poll and just see where we are at this moment, and we'll share the results as well. So when we asked about the declarations in place, many of you do, 63% of the participants here on this call today, you actually have a local declaration in place. But then we have some that don't have it in place. Of those of you that have that declaration in place, Only 29% can definitively say, yes, we are working towards this. 29%, same amount, would say no. And that 42% is somewhat. And that somewhat is also a very dangerous place to be, because we really do have to get to a place of action. We just wanted to poll and see where everyone is at this point, and we can close out of that. Thank you, Deanna. This is where we are today, and we know this. We know folks really want to do this work, and we know folks are having a challenge with how do we do this work. And so my next question for Andy and Katrice, what type of infrastructure specifically, and Andy, you spoke a little bit about the Office of Health Equity. I'm sure you can expand a little on that. What specific type of infrastructure is needed to address racism at the local level to really impact our MCH outcomes?
I'll start. I heard it said once that, you show your priorities by your checkbook and your calendar. So there's a piece here of like, if you don't have staff time dedicated to this, it ain't a priority. If you don't have money dedicated to this, it ain't a priority. If it's just sort of on the back burner hanging out, then that's the work of like, how do we get some people who they're going to come in and day out and think about how we move this work forward. And also related to that is, how do we make sure that those people are not just siloed off in some part of the health department where they can be ignored? Like, they need to be in a position with responsibility across the department, connections across the department, pulling everybody in. And so that's one piece. And then you've got to be dedicating some money to this work and figuring out how that is. And again, if you're at a staff level like me, that's a challenge because you don't control the checkbook. But that's that part of working with community members to put pressure, working with your Board of Health to put pressure, wherever it needs to come from, but figuring out what needs to happen so that there can actually be dedicated resources. And part of that is sometimes you're in that place of struggling to come up with the money and all of that. But we were lucky again that we were doing a lot of this work beforehand. And then so when this whole slew of COVID related grants came out, we were in a place where we could build the equity work right into the COVID grants. And so that was one place where we could go ahead and be able to expand and build that office out through that connection of, yes, we need this declaration work to go on, and we're going to do it through the lens of COVID as the stepping stone to what needs to continue beyond.
I absolutely agree with everything Andy said. I absolutely agree with it. Well stated. This work has to live in a specific department, office, or full-time position. Keyword, full-time. Oftentimes these initiatives are hidden with other initiatives and programs. Maybe someone who's already overly worked this is added on to their list of responsibilities. So then they're overwhelmed, or they're just not sure where to fit this piece in. There's not alignment. And that's very telling of the level of commitment for this work. And another piece of it, that there has to be strategy, like a real strategy built in. So priority areas, goals, objectives, an evaluation plan, a timeline, to Andy's point, a budget. You need funding to execute this work, just like anything else. It amazes me how funding can be allocated to other programs and initiatives, but when it comes to equity work, they expect us to just magically come up and do this work out of thin air. We don't need resources to do it. Yes, we do. It requires resources. It requires talent. It requires funding. It requires a structure built around it to make sure that it's sustainable. And that it's just not a limited time, a couple of months or a couple of years. So I think for me personally, that's always frustrating, especially when we think about the talent itself. Pay people. You pay consultants big money to do work in the communities we serve. But once again, when we come to equity, we don't view people as consultants. We don't view them as certain professional roles and give them the fee that they deserve for the amount of work that they're doing. And that's unfortunate. And we need to change our focus and really look at this work as important, as valuable. The community input that we receive, they should be compensated for their time. View them as consultants. I've heard many things about focus groups, and we're just going to convene community members, community residents together and give them $5 gift cards or feed them. And yet they will tell us everything about their lived experiences. So when we talk about infrastructure, it's really thinking through all of the facets of this work. What will it entail? What type of support is needed? How can we make this organized? How can we make this similar to how we run other departments? Hopefully we're running it that way, but I think we don't always have a business mindset when it comes to equity work as we do in other projects in other areas. And I hope that we can change that. But to do this work effectively, to make sure that it's equitable, to make sure that it's sustainable, we have to make sure we're building in this infrastructure at the very beginning. It has to be the forefront. It can't be an afterthought. It can't be, we've already built these programs and initiatives, and now let's think about whatever remaining we have left in the budget. Let's put it towards, racism as a public health crisis. Let's go to the funders and let's say, okay, it's end of December, or your fiscal year, and what do you have left? What do you need? Those questions have to come at the top of when you're even thinking about a proposed 2022 budget or whatever that may look like. So we have to change the conversations around this work. And verbal support is not enough. It's just not enough. So thank you for the statements. Thank you for your interviews. Thank you for taking our meetings. But what will you do to help us put this work into action? Let's have those conversations. Here are our lists of what we know this work requires, and what are you willing to do or willing to match or contribute to the conversation. So that's my thought on that.
Thank you both. Like, if we can snap for those. Andy, I love the priorities. Your priorities by where your money is and what your calendar says, right? Like by your checkbook and your calendar. I love that. And to piggyback off what Katrice said, really thinking about a business case behind this is important. I believe a few years ago now, it might be more than a few, Kellogg released a document that was the business case behind health equity or racial equity work. And that speaks to some of this. When we do not address issues of racial equity, it affects all of us. And this is what people are losing. It doesn't just affect Black people or Native people or Hispanic folk or any other person of color. It affects all of us. And so by addressing and really moving towards this action and all the things that we're saying, we're impacting the health of the entire nation. We're improving the health of everyone. We're improving the health of moms, babies, and families everywhere. If we look at our maternal mortality stats, specifically in the nation, we are doing so poorly compared to nations similar to ours. So we have, of course, those disparities when we look at Black, Native, or Hispanic populations. But if we just look at what is happening amongst the white population, there are great disparities there if you look at us compared to other similar nations. So by addressing health and racial equity, we're helping everybody. And so I wanted to pose another question to everyone via our poll. We're going to have two more, full disclosure. But I really want to see where we are today. And so the arrow right there at the top, Deanna. There you go, enthusiasm. I'll tell you when to load it. We really want to ask you all about where you are in your enthusiasm for this work today. So last year, everyone put these declarations in place. We're like, yes, we can get going, we can do. Where are you today in your level of enthusiasm for the work compared to 1 year ago, maybe when your local declaration was put into place or something of that nature? Where are you? And we will go ahead and launch the poll right now. 1, are you at much less enthusiasm? 2, less enthusiasm. 3, about the same. 4, more enthusiasm. Or 5, much more enthusiasm. Where are you and just your enthusiasm for this work a year ago as compared to today? And we'll give you all a few seconds to poll in. I see lots coming in, so we'll give you a second to do so.
Jessica, while we're letting poll results come in, I was just gonna, if you haven't looked at Racial Equity Institute's like groundwater approach and how they basically are talking about racism as something that's toxic, and that, we often, they use this metaphor of if you've got a lake and there's one dead fish in the lake, that's a fish problem. But if half the fish are dead, then that's a lake problem. And that if all the surrounding lakes, all have dead fish in them, then that's something wrong with what's upstream of all of those lakes, that feeds into all of them, and that's a groundwater issue. And part of that also is just acknowledging that, yes, racism is toxic, and it's toxic to everybody. So just to those points you were highlighted, yes, the dehumanization and discrimination experienced by people of color is extremely toxic, but white people are living in a toxic environment too. And that shows up in the level of anxiety and shame that white people live with on a daily basis, because your worth is still conditional. It's not conditional in the same way, but it's still conditional. And part of that piece of like this being a side thing, of we'll get to it thing, is you don't recognize how it's killing you too.
All right. That is very true. I second the groundwater approach, and looking into that. We will end the poll. And when we looked at enthusiasm for our group here today, we have most everyone, about 39% at more enthusiasm, which is encouraging. We have 14% at much more enthusiasm, 3 at about the same, but we also have folks at the less enthusiasm and much less enthusiasm. As we stated at the beginning, this work is difficult. And we know that we've not only been trying to do racial equity work for quite a while, but we've also really been doing this racial equity work in a time like COVID, in a pandemic that is ongoing, and the stress that is laid on folks. We understand why some folks might be at, I'm tired, and I'm tired of saying the same things. I'm tired of us doing the same thing, and maybe even feeling a little bit discouraged. And we understand, and we are also remaining in a place of hope. And so we really are encouraged by those of you who are like, we're still here. We're still trying to keep going. With that in mind, I do have a couple of questions for Andy and Katrice. How do you build this work into the culture of your organization? So not just then the infrastructure, how do you begin to build this work into the DNA, into the culture and the way that you do work, period? Anything that you have, has anything worked for you in your organization? Any advice you would give to those on the call today?
Katrice, I went first last time, so you feel free to take it unless you want to punt it to me.
No, it's fine. So my first suggestion is to really examine what is the culture. I think we're often quick to just act, especially when oftentimes equity work can seem as though a buzzword going around. There's a pressure. Now we're seeing more funding towards this work, I think more so in my opinion than I've seen in recent years. So people are just quick. We want the funding. This is important. These are making headlines. These organizations are getting this funding. We want to be among the list of organizations. And there's no strategy. There's no thought around, why are you doing this work? What is the importance of it behind just the funding piece of it? So I think first really understanding what the culture is, how racism is manifested, what are the challenges, what are the barriers? Looking from a strengths-based approach, what are the strengths? What are the assets? What are areas that we're doing really well in? Where do we strive in? Where are areas that we need to improve in? So I think really gauging an assessment of what culture looks like in your organization, within your community, within that department, whatever that sphere of work you're in doing this work. I think that's the first thing. And that will help really shed light, okay, where are the issues at? What are we really trying to change? And what will it look like if we say that we've addressed racism, we've shifted the culture, we are centering equity? How will we know that actually exists? How would that feel? What would that look like? How would that be different? Who would be at the table that's currently not at the table? And having those conversations, I believe, lays some foundation of where you want to strive towards. And then also, I think that's important to set the tone. So what are your intentions? And make that very clear. Communicate that so everyone is fully aware of what we're doing, the purpose of this work, Think about guiding principles. You know, I don't believe that this work can be done just winging it. You know, you have to have a foundation. You have to stand for something. You have to have a solid foundation to begin this work. So if a guiding principle is trust, and then make sure that you're providing safe spaces where people can openly express themselves, that they can talk about their feelings, that we can talk about racism and not dance around it, which we often do, even in equity-centered spaces, as you know, we may intentionally feel that they are, but we really aren't addressing the core underlying issues where we're tiptoeing around them. If your guiding principle is honesty, then you have to speak truth to power. You have to talk about the dynamics. You have to talk about the systems in place. You have to talk about historical racism and how it's impacted your communities. You have to talk about some of these organizations and the way that they're funding. You have to talk about some of the people in leadership. I mean, these are uncomfortable conversations. I get it. Depending on where you are on the totem pole, you may feel that, you know, do you have the ability to voice that without consequences? You know, can you freely express your concerns without it coming back to you in a negative way and then impacting your professional role? We hope that that would not happen. But I think, you know, being honest, that sometimes we've seen in the past where that does come to bite someone. So it's managing that balance. But that's where that culture comes in, to say we're creating a space. We are serious about this work. We have to acknowledge inequities that exist. We have to acknowledge power imbalances. We need to acknowledge moments where, you know, maybe there has been majority white leadership around issues of Black and Brown communities. Was that the best fit? You know, in certain situations, did we fund these dollars that we received in the most equitable way into communities that needed them the most? Or did we shift them to better serve our own interests and priorities? I mean, that's the reality of doing this work. And I think from that, and I saw Zoe's comment in there, is from that setting that tone and those guiding principles, then you look through those structural pieces of HR. It's embedded in the policies, it's embedded in the practices, it's embedded in the procedures, and the people that you have in the table. You're being more intentional. You're thinking about the overall goals of this work, and that we're not just going to talk about it as though it's a special project, but how do we infuse this? How do we integrate this into the core, into the facet of everything that we do? Does that mean that we have to look at revisit our mission statement or our vision statement or our staffing structure or our HR policies and transform that piece of it? So I think that that's how you begin to start building that into culture. Being very mindful of terminology that you use, being very mindful of, you know, holidays and observances and the communications. I think once you start thinking about the culture and the changes you want to see, you begin those processes of how do we move forward in changing the culture of our department or our organization or some of those systems that are connected.
And I'll just add, if you didn't catch it, I dropped something in the chat that's like stages of racial equity work. And one of those pieces that speaks to this part of like stage 2 is making them some sort of explicit commitment. So like the declarations, but then it shows you that here's all the extra stages you still got to go through to be really at a place where this is built into practice. But stage 1 is like business as usual, where again, sort of, you know, a culture dominated by sort of white expectations, as well as like kind of unhealthy male, you know, cultural components that I struggle with. You know, in public health, we're often so female dominated, and yet we still struggle to get out of this expectation of like, oh, we function in this type of way because that's professional. And sometimes what we really mean is like, oh no, that's male, but we don't catch it and don't say it. And it's this piece of like, what I hope one of the shifts that happens in terms of COVID is that in terms of the conversation around self-care and mental health, that needs to go hand in hand with the conversation around how to do equity, because you can't do equity work without also paying attention to self-care and mental health, is this piece of like, we got to be real with, there are identity issues going on within our nation right now, and the emotional issues going on within our nation that just have to be part of the conversation. If we're going to be real about all of this, like, there's just lots of built up hurt, lots of built up distrust, lots of built up anxiety. And if we really want to get to some form of racial healing, we got to be able to talk about all of those things. We got to be able to be real with them all. And so if you don't have a culture that can do that, then you need to go find the people in your community where you can sit down and have those candid conversations. Because that was part of what, like, I ended up doing. I got be part of a fellowship, but felt like, okay, can't quite do this in our department yet. So I put out a call to like find people that were working in public health locally to be able to get together with on a regular basis. And everybody was like, yes, let's take off the organizational hat. Let's drop the politics. Like, let's just talk about all of this in a very real way. So if you don't have it in your department, your organization, go find it in your community. Go find the people that you need to like have for support to be that kind of culture that really can nurture you and help sustain you when things are tough, to keep going. And then that will also help you figure out what you find within this community of people that you then need to start trying to build into your organization.
Yes, very, very great points. Oh, go ahead, Katrice.
I just want to add something quickly because I saw Zoe's comment and I mentioned the HR, but I think she did a great job of really specifying, especially the data-driven approach. And this means equity audits of your compensation, recruitment, retention, and leadership outcomes. Yes, 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 and yes. You know, we need to hold organizations and departments accountable. How are you equitably making sure that compensation is appropriate? How are you looking at your recruitment and retention strategies? How are you looking at performance? And that should be dressed appropriately. We should not be paying people for poor behavior, not in this space. And we should not be giving people pennies for doing this work, which we often see as well. So I think that is a major component of changing the culture and building into the culture. Are you invested in the people doing the work? Are you going to pay them equitably? Are you going to make sure that you are assessing the quality of their performance based on this equity strategy that you built within your organization that you intend to? So I definitely want to highlight, I mentioned that just overall with the HR, but I appreciate that Zoe really pulled that out and explicitly stated that, because that's very important.
Completely agree. Go ahead, Andy.
I was going to say, I'm loving the Zoe's making her voice heard, even though she can't speak.
We really appreciate you being here, Zoe. Lots of great input. And I will say Andy, Zoe, and Katrice helped design this whole thing. So really wanted to have your voice in here. One of the things that I think both of you mentioned is like really thinking about, one, your intention and that culture that you're creating, but like re-examining your mission statement. Like, why are you doing this work? What does that mean? And I think that speaks to that joint statement that we have with the other three organizations. But CityMatCH is actually currently in a strategic planning process where we will be changing our mission statement that has been in place for a number of years, but we're changing it. We're thinking about the language that we're using and how are we intentionally making sure that we're including everyone, that we're really centering families as a whole. And so we're thinking about our language. What are we focused on? How are we focused on it? Who are our partners? Who are we engaging? How? What are we doing internally? That piece that Zoe put in about really evaluating folks and building it into the infrastructure also helps to create that culture. So thank you all for bringing up those really great points. We're going to bring up a PowerPoint slide very quickly. We don't have very many, but I want to share this one graphic that Andy actually introduced to us. We can go to that second slide, please. Around the phases of disaster and what this means normally and what it means for us today in the world of COVID. So Andy, I'll turn it to you.
So as part of all the burnout going on within our health department, we started working with our like regional mental health organization, specifically the part within them that focuses on like responding to disasters. And, you know, yes, COVID is a different animal than a flood or a hurricane, a tornado, all of that. But some of the same pattern still plays out. So it's not the like, this isn't the 1 year sort of deal. Obviously, we keep going with this, but recognizing this piece of like, we've been living in a stage of disillusionment, partly due to all the like political pushback against public health efforts going on, but also just in the like, this is so hard for so long element to all of this, that there's some power to just like knowing that this is okay. Like this is the stage that we move through, and we can't necessarily shortchange it, but it still stinks. But then in light of that, knowing that this is a natural stage, what's the best sort of approach we can take to, again, making sure we're prioritizing self-care, making sure we're prioritizing mental health. And to some degree, like there's an equity component to that, because again, it's like, it's you matter as a human being. Like that's an essential piece of like a skill that we need to be able to have. And part of our culture is like, you just matter flat out. And so then getting from there to what is the like the new culture, the new health department, the new community, the post-COVID world we want to create. What does that look like? Because there is this opportunity of sort of the reset that's happened with COVID to hopefully build something new and build it better.
Thank you, Andy, for walking us through that graphic. I thought that was a really great way to just pictorially see, you know, where we are compared to like a normal, I use normal very loosely, disaster, and where we are right now. One of the things that both Katrice and Andy have been alluding to is like, how are we sustaining ourselves and each other in this work? When we think about racial equity work and the declarations that we have in place, and Katrice, I think you said this at the beginning of your statements, oftentimes racial equity work falls on the shoulders of Black people and people of color. It should not. It should be the responsibility of everyone. But either way, it is a very heavy load and burden to carry. And so we will be sending out one more poll before we go into a little breakout activity. We want to just gauge, this is a real talk conversation, where you are on your burnout meter. So we'll be launching that right now. On your burnout meter, where are you? Number 1, burnt to a crisp and you want to quit today. Drowning, but doggy paddling through, you're here. You're remaining in a place of hope, or you're cruising along smoothly. I made this scale. It is not evidence-based or anything of that nature. I deal with this work through a little bit of humor. Not that it's funny at all. This is just my way of coping so that I don't reach burnt to a crisp. And so where are you honestly today when it comes to working through racial equity work, thinking through where we are today with declarations or where we aren't today with declarations? This is a really just real snapshot on today. Where are you? All right, we'll be closing the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, and let's share those results. Here's where we are, and this is kind of what I expected. I feel like many of us are drowning, but we're just here doing this. My head is still afloat. I'm still making it through. Let me doggy paddle on through it. A lot of people are just here, and I get it. It's been a long couple of years with the pandemic, and we have been fighting for racial equity for many, many reasons. Oh, Sarah, I see your kind of comment. You are right. It is evidence-based. Look at that good bell curve. You are completely correct in that. And also, many people are also still remaining in a place of hope and cruising along smoothly as well, a few folks. I will say, I know for me, where I am on this scale changes day to day, sometimes hour to hour, right? And I want to say that that is okay, but it's good for us to acknowledge where we are in this work and where we are mentally, physically, and emotionally in moving through this. Racial equity work, especially for Black people, especially for people of color. The burden that you carry, even if you're just doggy paddling through, even if you show up every day with a smile on your face, it resonates somewhere in your physiological body as well. And so we really want to be sure that people are taking care of themselves in the midst of working through this, in the midst of fighting through moving a declaration from a plain statement to actual action. Ways that you can do this really, look at your policies, your practices, your procedures. We have many partners on the call today. Think about how we can impact policy and how we can impact the work we do at every level, so that when folks are at the local level moving this work on the ground, it is made easier for them so they're not hitting red tape at every turn. What opportunities exist? How are we thinking outside of the box? How are we intentionally speaking to the right people who are doing this work on the ground anyway? How are we intentionally incorporating community into how we're facing this? We cannot do business as usual. Business as usual has not worked. So as we're really thinking through what we need to do to move towards action, one piece that we did want to make sure you all have an opportunity to do is think about a method for looping in people who might be on the outskirts. Maybe someone's a little interested in being a part of your work within your declaration, but they're not quite sure. We want you to have a tool to be able to go to your stakeholders, to go to potential partners, to go to potential community members, and to concisely say why it is important for them to engage in racial equity work in your local community for the improvement of birth outcomes. Why is it important to do so? So we're going to bring the slides back up, screen share, and right to the PowerPoint. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Just go to full screen there on the bottom, right. Perfect. All right, next slide, please. All right, so our activity today, what we are going to do is an activity that is called a 27-9-3 persuasive messaging technique. This was created by M&H Strategic Services to convey powerful and concise messages with 3 or less ideas. So everyone on the call today will have an opportunity to quickly practice it. It'll be just a quick breakout session. We really want you to think about what type of message you would create to someone who might be interested or maybe just on the outskirts of interest in racial equity work. What kind of message would you create to them on the importance of engaging in racial equity work for the improvement of birth outcomes specifically? And you don't have to say, if you have a different area, feel free to use that as well. The 27-9-3 persuasive message contains 27 words. It could be less, I guess. And it's something you can say in 9 seconds that covers 3 concepts. So this is commonly used with politicians, amongst politicians, to quickly state what their stance is on something. 27 words, 9 seconds, 3 concepts. So of course, we're going to model it. So you have an example. Next slide, please. We here in Omaha are doing some local health equity social justice work. No worries, go back one. And I will turn it over to Andy to really just touch a little bit on our work here and walk through our description and how we've turned our description into a 27-9-3 persuasive message today.
So one of the other things to just check out if you haven't, look at some of the work that Michigan has done for their health equity and social justice workshop. And so again, some of the things of like ways to prioritize this work. We wanted to be able to have a similar sort of workshop to what Michigan did of this is when we bring people together, you know, not just within the health department, but beyond to really have the candid conversations. And so this is already built out. We were able to get Denise Evans to come in, do a great train the trainer with us on how we could train up people to be able to lead this workshop. We now have 22 people that have been trained on this and are going to start offering these workshops in the next year. This was our short description of like sort of the elevator pitch. You can see it did not meet the criteria. We had 59 words. It took 21 seconds to get it out. It did at least have just 3 concepts, but they're convoluted. So, and I also want to just say really quickly, all credit to Zoe, because she was the person that was like, this is a great approach. We all need to do this and build this into this session. So if you want to go ahead and go, you can see everybody hopefully has had a chance to read that. And then you can see if you go ahead and build it out and the 27-9-3, what it looks like shaped that way.
All right. Next slide, please. Okay, so you all will be going into breakout rooms. And can you stop share real quick? I just want to see how many people we have in here right now. 33. Okay. All right, so we'll go into breakout rooms. We'll have 5 people or less per room. We want you to just practice this. This also gives you an opportunity to meet other folks in the session. We want you to develop a quick elevator pitch, a 27-9-3 based on why it's important to focus on racial equity work. What would you tell someone to persuade them to engage in this work with you all? So we have about 100 folks on. We'll go into about 20 breakout rooms. If you go to breakout rooms and create 20, please. We will send you off into breakout rooms for just 20 minutes, or sorry, just for 10 minutes. Please introduce yourself, your pronouns, the organization you with, if that applies to you, and then go into just a brief conversation with one another. How would you develop a 27-9-3 just around why we should do racial equity work? So feel free to go into those spaces. Katrice and Andy, you might get kicked out into one of the spaces. Feel free to come back if you need to. But we will let you go right now. And 10 minutes from now, we'll pull you on back in. All right, and we'll open rooms. Okay. Folks should be floating in as they can. All right, and if anyone is having issues joining a room, please let us know. I know some folks are just listening in, so you can't join into a room, which is perfectly fine. But if you are able to, feel free to go into a room and speak to someone. If you went into a room that had a small amount of people and you'd like to be placed somewhere else, we can do that as well. Just come off of mute and let us know. Okay, she asked for help. Let's go to her room and we'll put her. Amy, how are you?
Hi, I'm the only one.
Yes, we're gonna put you in another rorum. So you'll see you move to another room. We're gonna leave really quickly, but then you'll float off to another room. So just 1 second. Just leave breakout room, yes. Hello, everyone. If you were unable to join a room for any reason and you would like to, please let us know. Otherwise, stay right where you are. We'll be having everyone come back in just about 5 minutes anyway. But we went through and just made sure that everyone had somebody in the room with them to talk through this. So you can just hold off and stay exactly where you are if you don't want to join the actual space. So we'll be coming back to do some popcorning and close out with our presenters in just a moment.
Hi Jessica, I had to leave shortly for something and
Completely understand, Ms. Michelle. You can leave at any time if you need to. We'll be coming back. We're bringing everyone back in about 3 minutes to close out. But if you have to leave, that's perfectly fine. We
well, I
understand.
had to leave and then I just got back. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, no problem. Sorry, I can update you on where we are.
Okay, can I
We
just
had
hang on here? Sorry?
everyone go into breakout rooms to practice
Okay.
developing a persuasive message. And so
Yeah.
folks are in breakout rooms and they're coming back in 2 minutes now. So
Okay.
you can stay here.
Okay.
That's perfectly fine. They'll be coming
Thank
back
you.
in 2 minutes and then we'll report out very quickly and then we'll close with a few things. So you can stay
Yeah,
exactly where you are. Be
someone
perfect.
needed something for a grant, so I had to rush and get to them. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. I know we're being pulled in different directions. So thank you for being on.
Okay, thank you.
All right, folks have about 40 more seconds to join, so I'm sure they're kind of wrapping up. Thank you all for participating in that. I know that was not a lot of time at all to even get to know each other. So our apologies, but we want to stay on schedule for you all. We'll give folks about another 25 seconds before they all come back in. And then we'll do a really quick wrap up and kind of next steps with you. Welcome back, welcome back. All right, I see folks floating again. Welcome back, welcome back. Thank you all for joining back in and participating in the breakout. We have a few more folks. Here they come. Rush of folks coming in. I'm so sorry. I feel like we have like a magic wand and we just pull y'all out of sessions when we do this. I'm so sorry. I know you were engaged in conversation, but thank you all for participating in that. We really appreciate each and every one of you for staying on and trying to talk through that. I know it was short. It was just 10 minutes, so you probably barely had enough room to touch the surface of this. But even if you just touched on a little bit, we'd love to hear, just popcorn out if you actually came up with a persuasive message, or even just the beginning thoughts of developing a persuasive 2793 around racial equity. We'd love to hear from a couple of groups that we're able to meet. Feel free to take yourself off of mute.
So our group was a little bit under 27 words, but we came up with all people have a right to a healthy life. Sweat equity is the most valuable equity, and equity work is about solidarity, not charity.
I love that. I absolutely love that. Do we have Ms. Sharon, were you going to say something? I'm sorry.
Yes, so we came up with the health of moms, babies, and families is critical to the future of our nation. Racism is at the core of what causes these inequities. And we came up at 25 words.
Great. That's awesome. When you're thinking about just going out and saying, why do we do this? This is why. Mr. Cole, go ahead.
Yes, hi. One of the things I wanted to know is, can we frame it as a question? So we kind of came up with optimal maternal, child, and adolescent health is a public health priority. Racism harms public health. Are you open to joining us in working to achieve optimum community public health?
I think that's a great question to close with. I think it's not even bad to add that. Maybe it doesn't fall quite into the 2793, but that's a great place to land. Like, are you open to it? You know, are you open to the conversation? Are you open to even thinking about this with us? I think that that works. Absolutely. Okay, anyone else want to share? You all had great conversation.
Our group came up with one thing. So we had 28 words. We tried to eliminate one. So ours was racial equity is essential in creating a world where the place a child is born doesn't dictate whether they live or die, and the quality of life.
Yes, absolutely. That is great.
I'll share, Jessica. This is Sarah Henneke. I honestly didn't count how many words we have, but I think it's less than 27. Women of color die more than white women, as well as their babies. Community programs such as home visiting and Healthy Start may help. Respectful and inclusive care may improve outcomes.
Those are awesome. I feel like you all really are using like all of the pieces, the data, both quantitative and qualitative data, to like make your point to say, this is why you should engage in, this is why we should care about this work. So I really appreciate like using all the pieces. Like there's so many components of MCH that I hear resonating throughout like all of your persuasive messaging. So that's amazing to hear. Any last one? And if not, we'll go into a couple of closing things. All right. I just want to say first, before I hand it over to Katrice and Andy, I hate that we couldn't be in person because I'm looking at all of your names, and I've been at CityMatCH for 5 years next week. It'll be 5 years for me. And it is wonderful to see all of your names, and I see your names and I imagine your faces. One, because we do all of your name tags normally in person, so a lot of the names are familiar, but two, because we work with a lot of you all, and I just appreciate seeing everybody here today. So thank you so much for joining us in this virtual experience. Today, we touched the surface on where Douglas County and the city of Cleveland and Buncombe County are today. We touched the surface on what it really means and what we need to consider in doing this work. I want you to know that CityMatCH, along with NICHQ, Healthy Start, and AmChip, we are all really committed to this work. A lot of what we discussed today was about that internal work, and that's a lot of where we are starting right now when it comes to racial equity. Our board is committed to this work, and I see a lot of our board members on the call today here for CityMatCH. We are committed to really moving this forward, and in the coming months and years, at least I can say this for CityMatCH for sure, you will see us building in more ways to support you all, our members, in moving declarations to action. We are constantly thinking about that and how we can evolve and what we can do for everyone. So just know we are committed to this work, to changing the way we're doing the work, but also serving you in the most optimal way as well. One of the things that we really focused on today was taking care of yourselves and each other. So this is how we kind of want to close out. I will have Andy and Katrice close with some remarks, but I also want you all, as they are speaking, to add to the chat. We would like you to answer the question, how are you building in joy? This work can be heavy and daunting and overwhelming, and we are in places where we're kind of like doggy paddling through, just present, remaining and holding on to hope. How are you building in joy? Please add that answer to that question in the chat as you sit and you think about that. I will turn it over to Andy and Katrice. Please give us any last remarks for advice you would have for anyone on the call about moving their declarations from paper to actual action, from words to action. And also, could you answer that question? How are you building in joy?
Well, I went ahead and took myself off mute, so I guess I'll go first. We talked about the tension in this work around being courageous and putting in the work, doing all the hard things, with then like the fact that you matter and therefore your health, your mental health matters. And so that's a huge challenge in terms of balancing that, because there are cultures that are toxic, and I've all probably experienced leadership that isn't worth the name. And there are times when you just got to take care of yourself, and that's okay. And to the degree that you are able to be courageous and find other people to support you so that you can be courageous together and work together to get the work done, that's what I would say. Find your group of people that are going to be your folks that help you get through this, that help you through the hard days. And again, if you don't have it within your organization, find it somewhere else in your community so that you have that, because you deserve it. And it's just necessary to keep doing this work for the long term. And as far as building in joy, that's really a piece of like spirituality for me, like that piece of, each and every human being is a child of God. I'm a child of God, and I need to spend time remembering that. And when I do that, and I notice all the other wonderful things going on in my life, then I experience joy pretty naturally, even while still being able to see the reality of the things that need to change in our world. Thanks, everybody.
Andy, you said exactly what I was going to say. We are just on the same wavelength today. I just first want to say thank you for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. My closing remarks would be just that it took at least 400 years of inequity to get us to this point. So we can't expect that we're going to be able to do this work in a couple of days, a couple of weeks, a couple of months, or a couple of years. We have to be realistic, but yet still work with a sense of vigilance and urgency, because it is so important. And especially knowing that our babies are not even seeing, the first year of life because of what environment surrounds them. But I really encourage you, in addition to your local networks, when we convene like this in a national platform, to take those partnerships seriously. I would say if we were in person, just don't take the business cards and put them in your pocket and then go to work and put them in your desk not to touch them again. Really reach out. We can't work in silos as far as cities and states. Collectively, as our nation, we have to do this work together. It's not enough if things are working well in North Carolina and in Cleveland, we're still struggling here. What does that say about our country? So I hope that we can really look at this work of what's happening at the local levels, but really how do we strengthen our country to make sure that there's equity in the fiber? We can get that. We know there's racism in the fiber. What, how can we do to really build equity in the fiber of our nation? So I really hope that you take these partnerships, contact information, feel free to reach out to me, and let's do this collectively. Let's continue these conversations beyond a certain conference, but to continue it all throughout the year. I agree with Andy, spiritual foundation keeps me going. There's a gospel song that says that the joy that I have, it doesn't come from this world and the world can't take it away from me. So I believe that that's the foundation of who I am, is my relationship with Christ and what I'm able to do, and then with the family that I have. But I do believe that this work is a calling and I don't take it lightly. But I find my joy in remaining, that no matter what happens on the outside, that no one can take that joy away from me. And I'm going to do everything to protect it and to honor it. And I encourage you to do the same. And then just find whatever else puts a smile on your face. If it's listening to music, it's being with loved ones. So I just thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Andy and Katrice. And we see all of your comments in the chat. And I want to point out, if this question was difficult for you, take it, reflect on it, journal on it, think about it, and build in joy for yourself, because this work is hard enough. Thank you so much to everyone for being on today. We are now going to be moving into a break time. So technically today from 12 to 2 Central Time, take that time for a break, lunch. We do have a workforce listening session. So if you are interested in that, that is taking place at 12:45 Central Time. So feel free to join. Anyone can join that session. But we will see you all this afternoon for more sessions. Please feel free to check out the agenda, interact with folks on the social feed. We super appreciate all of you being here today. Enjoy the remainder of conference and be sure to reach out to us via all of our socials and on the platform and things of that nature. Andy, Katrice, Zoe, thank you so much. We appreciate you all and enjoy the rest of conference. Oh, not yet. Not yet. Not yet. Pause the recording. Top left.